Hi, my name is Seth. As Ida said, I'm a socialist activist from the States and a migrant solidarity campaigner. I think what's happening in the U.S. is important for those of us in Britain for three reasons. One has to do with climate change. One of the really frightening developments surrounding the wall that we saw over the past several weeks was the way that Trump sought to resolve some of the fiscal obstacles to funding it, which was taking money from disaster relief in Puerto Rico and sending it to the border. This actually wasn't the first time that Trump has put the border put the border ahead of dealing with climate change. Following the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey and Hurricane Florence, over $10 million were taken from FEMA in order to direct them to ICE, who needed it to get more beds so that they could detain more people. And I think that these kinds of connections are very, very important in the context of rising environmental militancy, particularly in Britain and elsewhere, because this is going to be a constituency that's going to be absolutely important for building a real movement for open borders. The second reason that the U.S. context is important is that has to do with the far right and fascism. And I don't think that the U.S. state or Trump himself really is a fascist, and nor is this the first time that Trump has declared a national emergency, as he did with the wall, in order to advance his agenda in the face of democratic procedure and opposition. But I think we have to be aware of the way that assaults on democratic procedure accumulate in this period, and I think we need to understand how immigration controls can be a kind of transitional program for the far right to assault democratic institutions and can open the way up for far more grisly agendas. And the third thing is that in the U.S. we've actually seen some of the most creative, sophisticated, and provocative and mass immigrants' rights organizing that I think we all have a lot to learn from. I'm going to talk about the politics surrounding the wall in a minute, but I think it's important to underline a theoretical point, which is that the physical barriers are just one manifestation of the border right now. Historically, in the United States, the Border Patrol has tried to define its remit from the technical borderline to the final destination of any immigrant in the U.S., which is they've tried to basically make their jurisdiction boundless. And most of the struggles that we've seen in the United States are about limiting and restricting the terrain of ICE to operate on. So at universities, we've seen the sanctuary campus movement. This was a movement that I was personally involved in before arriving here. This then spread to the healthcare industry as the American Medical Association made calls for sanctuary hospitals. Another campaign has been among public bodies, has been about a campaign against E-Verify, which is a program that forces on hiring applications to ask about immigration statuses. And this is something that has also been integrated into sanctuary campus campaigns as well. And other campaigns have involved getting ICE out of prisons and jails, which is where a lot of detentions and kidnappings take place. And as most of these campaigns have sort of built up over the course of time, this is where the Abolish ICE movement comes into being. And this was a demand that was largely on the margins of the movement for a while, either by socialists. This was a demand that was made by socialist organizations or radical immigrants' rights groups, but it only gets to have a constituency, not necessarily common sense, but a constituency that politicians have to take seriously when Trump institutes his family separations policy. And I'm going to talk a little bit at the end about why I'm actually quite hopeful about the immigrants' rights movement in the United States, but I think the movement right now faces some very serious challenges. One is that the movement remains right now in a fundamentally reactive mode and isolated from mass organization. Most of the time stewarded by NGOs, which serves as a transmission belt oftentimes between mass mobilizations and street demonstrations, which can be very, very large, into voter registration and lobbying efforts, which are demobilizing. And this has meant that campaigns against local governments who are supporting detention centers, like the one that's actually taking place in Houston right now, where I'm from, or Occupy ICE actions or other physical confrontations with the deportation machinery have been isolated, and so isolated such that the far right has actually been able to physically disrupt them in a couple of instances by the Patriot Front or the Proud Boys. These are street movements in the U.S. And two, because the movement has failed to activate itself within communities in a mass way, the threat of state terror and raids has understandably been a very powerful disciplinary mechanism on migrant activism. The other crucial arena has obviously been the migrant caravans from Honduras, Nicaragua, Guatemala, and El Salvador, fleeing the consequences of U.S. imperialism in Latin America. The first thing to say is that these are by far and away the most sophisticated and modern forms of working class organization in terms of their mass character, their support of democratic decision making and collective debate, their construction along lines of solidarity, and their ability to preserve these structures in motion as they cross state lines and as they face state harassment. On the one hand, they reference movements in Latin America, such as the MST, such as the Landless Workers Movement, the MST in Brazil. In other ways, I actually think they anticipate forms of organization and struggle that we're going to be seeing more of, and we have to take seriously and figure out a way to materially support. And while I think Standing Rock provided a precedent for the kind of solidarity needed at the border, I think the movement right now has been caught off guard by the caravans, even though they've been coming for many years. When they reached the border, they were met with tear gas. I think that many activists in the movement have to face the question of how do we bring a Standing Rock type physical confrontation to the border in order to open up the real divisions that actually do exist within border communities about the wall and about the militarization of the border. And these divisions exist between local governments and federal agendas. And those can be opened up and widened by a much more confrontational and mass resistance at the border. And again, I think that these are open questions for the movement that are continuing to be answered right now. Now, I want to say a few things about the wall, because I think it allows us to see how U.S. immigration policy has changed, how radically it's changed, and how the wall relates to a particular crisis within U.S. imperialism at the moment. Similar to Britain for most of U.S. history, the U.S. has maintained an open border policy, and it pursued this agenda quite consciously in order to satisfy the demands of mining and agro industries in the early 20th century. The first immigration restrictions are imposed in 1924. And the link between what the border is and its purpose in sort of regulating the supply of labor to meet the needs of capitalists is quite transparent during this period. And this is the reason why the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the INS, which becomes ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, and the CPB, Customs and Border Protection. This is the reason why the INS is originally organized in the Department of Labor and remains that way for some time. The link between the personnel of ICE, of the Border Patrol originally drew from white personnel within police, the Texas Rangers, the most sort of brutal sections of the armed forces, and the intelligence services. And this link between particularly the special forces and the intelligence services of the state and the Border Patrol only grows over time as the personnel who are carrying out counterinsurgency operations in Latin America against workers and peasants organizations are then funneled back into the Border Patrol and carry their experience into that. But the move to actually put a physical barrier on the border actually doesn't come, oddly enough, from the far right. It's an idea that actually emerges from within the political center of the United States. It comes particularly from Jimmy Carter and Richard Nixon. And during this period in which the wall is actually becoming a serious initiative that the state wants to pursue, this is a period in which countries around the world are all pursuing the construction of physical barriers on the border. The Israeli state, India, Britain, actually, in Northern Ireland. These are all things that people within the state are exploring during this time, trying to figure out what's the legal basis for them. So there's actually like one recorded physical barrier for regulating the border in the world post World War II. This climbs to around almost 20 by 1991. And then after 1991, the number of physical barriers around the world climbs from 19 to over 45. In the United States, the genesis of the idea for a physical barrier on the border comes from the Pentagon, the State Department, particularly in the context of the Vietnam War, as the U.S. military is thinking about imposing a border between North and South Vietnam. And this idea finds its way home. The context of the Vietnam War is also very, very important because the servicemen that come home, particularly the white servicemen who've been ideologically processed through anti-communism, come back to the U.S. South and then are integrated into the U.S. far right, and then become the predecessors of many of the far right vigilante groups that we see on the border. And so as the particular shape of U.S. imperialism changes, the organization of border supervision and how the far right kind of talks about it changes. So for most of its history, the Border Patrol was organized under the Immigration Naturalization Service, the INS, from 1933 to 2003. This is dissolved following 9/11, and the INS is reorganized into ICE and the CBP, which are subdivisions of the Department of Homeland Security, to prosecute the domestic war on terror. And so Islamophobia then becomes absolutely central to the reproduction of the border in the United States. This is important because Islamophobia is essentially, the U.S. ruling class has sort of run out of ideas for how it wants to pitch and justify its imperialist adventures abroad, and Islamophobia is basically the last argument it has now. Even when Trump talks about the border today, he's always talking about it in the context of quote unquote terrorists that want to come through the southern border. Even when he talks about the U.S.-backed coup in Venezuela, most of the stories that he likes peddling is the whole notion that Hezbollah is operating in Venezuela and has alliance with Maduro or something like that. Cool, great. So Islamophobia is absolutely central to the reproduction of the border, and this is the reason. And so it's no accident why the first mass opposition to Trump's border agenda after he's elected is not actually at the border. It's at the airports, and it's against the Muslim ban. And as with the women's marches and the airport demonstrations following Trump's election, there was a big question about what kind of mass opposition we would be seeing from the immigrant community in the States. And the key reference for this were the mass strikes that took place in 2006 against what was the Sensenbrenner bill. And this was a bill to move the status of being undocumented and the status of being undocumented and anyone who is protecting undocumented people in the United States from a civil penalty into a criminal penalty. And this galvanized a mass movement from March to May of 2006. And from between March and May, over 5 million people take to the streets in opposition to the agenda. And on May 1st of 2006, which was a Monday and is not a holiday in the United States, this was a strike action, nearly 2 million people across the country are on strike. And it effectively stunned a ruling class agenda in its tracks completely. And it's important to think about that event and think about what made the mega marches of 2006, which again is the largest labor action in U.S. history, possible. And I think it was 3 things. One is that the Sensenbrenner bill was a clear enemy, and it was coming from the legislature. It wasn't coming it wasn't coming directly as sort of an executive action, and it wasn't. The way Trump has sort of prosecuted his border agenda has been far more sort of through the channels of state terror and less through sort of clear acts of legislative assault. Second reason was that the churches in the immigrant community were absolutely pivotal to the mega marches of 2006. And the churches played an absolutely pivotal role from 1982 to 1996 in the sanctuary movement led by many refugees from fleeing U.S.-backed intervention in Latin America. And the churches played an absolutely mobilizing role in getting people out onto the streets. 3 is that the politics of what's happening in Mexico actually matters. And in 2006, and from above and from below. So from above, Vicente Fox in 2006, whom I have no love for, did use radio to actually call Mexican migrants out onto the streets to protest, and that was very, very important and crucial. The other thing that was that was very, very significant was actually that, May 1st, 2006 was the date of the mega marches in the States. It was also 2006 was also the period of the Oaxaca Teachers Rebellion in Mexico. And I think that's something that we need to think very, very deeply about, especially given the fact that mass strikes are taking, a mass strike wave is taking place among the maquiladores in Mexico right now, galvanizing tens of thousands of workers on strike. And I think that there's absolutely a correlation between rising class struggle in the U.S. and in Mexico, and I think that's going to play an absolutely pivotal role in galvanizing a very confident immigrants' rights movement on both sides of the border. Now, the labor movement has largely remained isolated from, the organized labor movement has been largely isolated from the migrant solidarity struggle, but I think that there are signs that that might be changing. Again, the largest demonstrations in the mega marches of 2006 on May 1st, half of that 2 million people came from LA. And one of the really exciting things about the recently is the Los Angeles teacher strike. And this is this put 30,000 teachers on strike, and demonstrations of 50,000 people in the community. These were schools with majority of students were Latino population. Many teachers talked about the reason that they went on strike was in solidarity with their students for anti-racist reasons. Two of the key demands of the LA teachers strike were, one, an end to random, racist police searches in schools, and two, their demand for an immigrant defense fund of $1 million. Now, they didn't actually win either of these demands technically, but the fact that these were demands that were, in the strike is absolutely important. What they did win was, they didn't win I don't think they won the first demand, but they did win the employment of a lawyer to help immigrants involved in schools. And one of the crucial roles that radical organizations have actually played in that strike is actually deepening the anti-racist politics of the community mobilization around the strike. So the International Socialist Organization, the organization that I am organized with in the States, initiated the Tacos for Teachers campaign, which mobilized large sections of the Latino community further into the struggle. Right now in Denver, there was a teacher strike, and one of the unfortunate things about this strike was that the DPS actually threatened publicly. They then had to retract this statement, but they actually sent a public email saying that we will pick up any teachers whose undocumented status is questionable. They eventually had to retract this, but it played a very, very effective role in disciplining the activism of those teachers. And unfortunately, the union didn't then put, or didn't from the beginning put, anti-racist demands and migrant solidarity demands in the context of the struggle. But one of the things that radical organizations have done during that strike is that they initiated a Tamales for Teachers campaign, which again tried to draw in a much more diverse community into the struggle. And I guess the one thing I'll end with is talking about like what the potential is for actually a movement in the United States that confidently embraces open borders. The context that we're in right now of actually rising class struggle in the United States is important because it was 20 years ago in 2000, following the 1996 UPS strike and actually a failed attempt to form an independent workers' party in the United States, that the AFL-CIO actually does an about-face and embraces a number of things. One, full amnesty for undocumented immigrants. Unconditional amnesty for them, an end to employer sanctions. They support whistleblower protections, and an end to the guest worker indentured servitude programs. And I think today there's a possibility to build. There's a serious potential, a challenging but serious potential to build a much more confident movement that embraces demands for open borders if the right connections and alliances are made with other rising movements, including the environmental movement and other anti-racist movements. So, thank you.